February 9th, 1945. 150 metres beneath the freezing Norwegian Sea, off the island of Fedje. The hydrophone operator aboard HMS Venturer pressed his headphones tighter against his ears, concentrating on the sound that had first seemed like a fishing boat's diesel engine. But this was no fishing boat. The rhythmic thumping, irregular and harsh, was the unmistakable signature of a German submarine's malfunctioning engine. In the cramped control room, 25-year-old Lieutenant James Launders stood motionless, his mathematical mind already calculating angles, depths and intercept courses, for a shot that had never been attempted in the history of naval warfare. Two submarines, both submerged, both blind except for the faint acoustic signatures picked up by primitive hydrophones, were about to engage in combat that would last 3 hours and end with one of them broken in half on the ocean floor. What neither crew knew as they manoeuvred through the dark water was that they were about to fight the only submarine-versus-submarine battle in history where both vessels remained completely submerged from first contact to final destruction. The German submarine U-864 had departed Bergen, Norway, on a mission so secret that even most of the crew didn't know their true destination. Operation Caesar, as it was codenamed, was Nazi Germany's desperate attempt to share advanced military technology with their Japanese allies. The cargo manifest told the story of a regime grasping at straws: 65 tons of liquid mercury, essential for manufacturing detonators and electrical switches; engine parts for the Junkers Jumo 4B, the revolutionary turbojet that powered the Messerschmitt Me-62, the world's first operational jet fighter; guidance systems for V-2 rockets; technical drawings and blueprints; 2 Messerschmitt engineers and 2 Japanese naval officers who would oversee technology transfer. If U-864 reached Japan successfully, these materials and expertise might extend the Pacific War by months, perhaps longer. The human cost of such a delay was incalculable. U-864 was a Type 9 D2 U-boat, one of Germany's largest submarine designs. At 290 feet long and displacing around 800 tons when submerged, she was built for exactly this kind of mission, extended ocean crossings to distant theatres. Commissioned in December 1943, she was commanded throughout her entire career by Korvettenkapitän Ralph Reimar Wolfram, an experienced officer who understood the stakes of Operation Caesar. The submarine was formidable, armed with 6 torpedo tubes, 4 at the bow and 2 at the stern, and could carry up to 22 torpedoes in a standard configuration. For this mission, however, with cargo taking priority over weapons, she carried only 4 torpedoes. Her armament also included a 105mm deck gun, though that would be useless in the battle to come. 2-man diesel engines gave her a surface speed of 21 knots, while electric motors provided 7 knots, submerged. More importantly, for long-distance operations, she could travel 12,750 nautical miles at cruising speed, enough to reach Japan via the Arctic route around Norway, through the Denmark Strait, and across the Atlantic before heading south around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. The route itself was a testament to Allied dominance of the seas by early 1945. The Mediterranean was completely closed to Axis vessels. The English Channel was a death trap. Even the traditional Atlantic routes were patrolled so heavily that survival odds for surfaced U-boats approached 0. Only the Arctic route, threading through Norwegian coastal waters before breaking out into the open ocean, offered any chance of success, and even that was marginal. U-864 had left Kiel, Germany in December 1944, making her way to the Norwegian port of Bergen. But the submarine was plagued by mechanical problems from the start. Shortly after arriving in Norway, tests revealed serious issues with her snorkel system, the revolutionary device that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged, drawing air through a retractable tube that barely broke the surface. For 2 months, German technicians worked to repair and modify the troublesome equipment. By early February, the repairs appeared complete. On February 5, 1940, the U-864 slipped from her berth in Bergen and headed northwest into the Norwegian Sea, beginning the most dangerous phase of Operation Caesar. The plan called for her to transit Norwegian coastal waters for 2 days, before breaking out into the open Atlantic. If she could survive the gauntlet of Allied patrols during that vulnerable period, her chances of reaching Japan improved dramatically. The first day passed without incident. By February 6th, U-864 was approaching the island of Fedje, about 30 miles north of Bergen, near the outer limits of Norwegian territorial waters. Captain Wolfram was running submerged, using the snorkel to charge batteries and refresh the air. The cramped submarine, packed with cargo and crew totaling 73 men, needed constant ventilation. This is when disaster struck, though not from any enemy action. One of the diesel engines began misfiring. At first, the problem seemed minor, an annoying irregularity in the engine's rhythm. But the misfiring grew worse, the engine coughing and sputtering with increasing violence. The engineering crew reported that the malfunction was severe and would likely lead to complete engine failure if not addressed. Worse still, the misfiring engine was incredibly loud, compromising the submarine's acoustic stealth. In waters known to be heavily patrolled by Allied forces, a noisy submarine was a dead submarine. Wolfram faced an agonizing decision. Continue the mission with a malfunctioning engine, risking breakdown in the open Atlantic thousands of miles from any friendly port, or return to Bergen for repairs, exposing U-864 to Allied patrols for another 2 days. While retracing her route, the captain chose prudence over glory. On February 9th, he turned U-864 around and headed back toward Bergen, where he had been promised an escort would meet him off the island of Hellesøy to protect the final approach to port. What Wolfram didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the British had been reading German naval communications for years. The German Enigma code, once thought unbreakable, had been compromised by brilliant mathematicians at Bletchley Park in England. When German naval headquarters transmitted orders regarding U-864's mission and movements, British intelligence intercepted and decrypted every word. The Admiralty in London had known about Operation Caesar from the beginning. They understood the strategic implications of advanced German technology reaching Japan. They knew U-864's approximate location and route, and they had a submarine already operating in the area specifically tasked with hunting German U-boats along the Norwegian coast. HMS Venturer was the lead boat of the British V-class submarine design, an evolution of the successful U-class that had proven so effective in Norwegian waters. She was considerably smaller than her German adversary, just 204 feet long, and displacing 670 tons surfaced, 740 tons submerged. Where U-864 was built for ocean crossing, Venturer was optimized for patrol operations, with better maneuverability and a faster submerged speed of 10 knots. Venturer's armament was straightforward, 4 21-inch torpedo tubes in the bow, with 4 reload torpedoes stored in the forward torpedo room. For this patrol, she carried 8 torpedoes total, Mark IV models that were reliable but primitive by modern standards. No homing capability, no sophisticated guidance systems, just compressed air propelling 1,700 pounds of Torpex explosive at 45 knots toward a target the torpedo couldn't see or track. She also mounted a 3-inch deck gun and 3 machine guns, none of which would matter in the engagement to come. What made Venturer truly dangerous wasn't her equipment but her captain. Lieutenant James Launders was 25 years old, young even by wartime standards, but he had already proven himself an exceptional submarine commander. A graduate of the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, Launders possessed the rare combination of technical expertise and intuitive tactical sense that defined great submarine captains. He was a mathematics prodigy, able to perform complex calculations in his head while managing the dozens of variables that governed submarine warfare. Speed, distance, bearing, depth, torpedo ballistics, ocean currents, temperature gradients that affected sound propagation, all of it had to be integrated into split-second decisions. More importantly, his crew trusted him completely. In the submarine service, where men lived in constant proximity to death, that trust was everything. Before the encounter with U-864, Venturer had already compiled an impressive record under Launders' command. She had sunk 12 Axis merchant vessels along the Norwegian coast, strangling Germany's ability to move iron ore and supplies by sea. In November 1944, she had surfaced and destroyed U-711 with gunfire after catching the German submarine on the surface. This 11th war patrol, which began on February 2nd when Venturer left Lerwick in the Shetland Islands, was supposed to be routine. Patrol the waters off Bergen, interdict German shipping, hunt for U-boats entering or leaving port. Just another dangerous mission in the grinding attrition of anti-submarine warfare. On February 6th, the same day U-864 first transited past Fedje without being detected, Venturer arrived at her assigned patrol area. For 3 days, Launders ran a methodical pattern, diving before dawn and patrolling submerged during daylight hours when aircraft posed the greatest threat, surfacing at night to charge batteries and refresh air. The Norwegian coast in February was brutal. Freezing temperatures, heavy seas, frequent storms that made periscope observations difficult and surface operations dangerous. But the weather also provided cover, masking the submarine's presence from enemy aircraft and patrol vessels. On the morning of February 9th, Venturer was patrolling submerged in the waters west of Fedje Island when the hydrophone operator reported a contact. The hydrophone was one of the oldest forms of submarine sensor, essentially a sophisticated underwater microphone that allowed operators to listen for the sounds of other vessels. Unlike active sonar, which broadcast sound waves that could be detected by the enemy, hydrophones were completely passive, receiving but not transmitting. The trade-off was range and precision. Hydrophones could only detect relatively loud noises, and determining the exact location of a contact required skill, experience, and often a large dose of guesswork. When Venturer's hydrophone operator first heard the unusual sound, he reported it as a possible fishing boat. The diesel engine noise was irregular, not the smooth rhythm of a military vessel. But something about the contact bothered Launders. They were in deep water, far from the usual fishing grounds. The weather was poor, not ideal for civilian operations, and the sound, while irregular, was too powerful to be a small fishing vessel. Launders made a decision that would prove crucial. Rather than use active sonar to precisely locate the contact, which would immediately alert any hostile vessel to Venturer's presence, he would rely entirely on passive hydrophones and visual observation through the periscope. It was a calculated risk. Without active sonar, tracking would be much more difficult. But if the contact was indeed a German submarine, as Launders was beginning to suspect, maintaining surprise was worth the disadvantage. He ordered a course change to close the distance to the contact, maintaining slow speed to minimize Venturer's own acoustic signature. As the British submarine crept closer, the hydrophone signature grew stronger and more distinct. That irregular thumping, the harsh mechanical sound, was definitely a diesel engine, a large one, operating at shallow depth. At 9:52 a.m., Launders raised the periscope for a quick look. Periscope discipline was one of the most important skills in submarine warfare. Keep the scope up too long, and the telltale feather of disturbed water might be spotted by enemy lookouts. Too brief, and you might miss critical information. Launders had perfected the technique, quick glimpses that minimized risk while gathering maximum intelligence. Through the periscope he saw it, a slender mast protruding above the surface, moving slowly through the choppy seas. Not a periscope, but a snorkel, the retractable air intake that allowed submarines to run diesel engines while remaining submerged. This was no fishing boat. This was a German U-boat. Launders lowered the periscope and considered his options. He had found a German submarine running submerged in exactly the patrol area where Admiralty intelligence had predicted U-864 would be operating. Standard tactics called for shadowing the target until it surfaced, then attacking with torpedoes or gunfire. Surface submarines were relatively easy targets, visible, slow, and vulnerable. But what if this submarine didn't surface? The snorkel meant it could remain submerged for extended periods, days potentially, running on diesel power while staying safely below the surface. Launders decided to follow the contact and wait for an opportunity. He ordered Venturer to a parallel course, maintaining position about 1,000 yards astern of the German submarine, using only hydrophones to track its movements. No periscope observations unless absolutely necessary. No active sonar. Complete stealth. The British submarine became a ghost, following its prey through the dark water. For the crew of U-864, the return to Bergen should have been routine. Yes, the engine malfunction was embarrassing and would delay the mission, but Bergen's repair facilities were excellent, and Captain Wolfram expected to be back at sea within a few days. The escort promised at Hellesøy would provide protection for the final approach to port. All they had to do was transit the final 30 miles without incident. But something was wrong. Wolfram couldn't identify exactly what, but his instincts, honed by years of submarine operations, were screaming a warning. There were subtle changes in the acoustic environment, faint sounds that might be another vessel, or might be nothing more than temperature gradients causing sound reflections. He ordered the submarine to begin zigzagging, changing course every few minutes in an invasive pattern designed to shake any potential pursuer. Aboard Venturer, Launders watched through the hydrophone signatures as the target's behaviour changed. The German submarine had detected something, probably not Venturer herself, but enough to make her captain nervous. The zigzagging made tracking infinitely more difficult. Every course change required Launders to recalculate the target's position, speed, and heading based on hydrophone bearings alone. It was like trying to follow someone through a dark room while blindfolded, using only the sound of their footsteps, while they constantly changed direction. The British crew settled into the grinding tension of the hunt. Hours passed. The hydrophone operator called out bearing changes. Launders calculated and recalculated positions. The submarine crept forward, maintaining contact but never closing too near, never making a sound that might alert the German crew to their presence. By early afternoon, Launders faced a critical decision. Venturer had been running submerged for hours, consuming battery power at an unsustainable rate. Soon, very soon, she would need to surface to recharge batteries, breaking contact with the target and potentially losing it forever. The German submarine showed no signs of surfacing. The snorkel allowed it to remain submerged indefinitely, or at least until it reached Bergen. If Launders was going to attack, it would have to be now, while both submarines were submerged, in a type of engagement that had never been attempted in the history of naval warfare. No submarine had ever deliberately attacked another submarine while both were underwater. The technical challenges were staggering. How do you aim torpedoes at a target you can't see, whose exact position is uncertain, whose depth is unknown, and which is actively manoeuvring to evade? Torpedoes of this era were designed to attack surface ships. They were set to run at relatively shallow depth, just beneath the surface, so they would strike the keel of the target vessel. The Markowitz torpedoes aboard Venturer could be adjusted to run deeper, but this required manual setting before launch, and there were no established procedures or tables for setting torpedoes to attack submerged submarines. The fire control systems aboard Venturer were designed to calculate intercept courses for surface targets, using visual observations of the target's bearing, range, speed, and heading. None of that information was available for a submerged target tracked only by hydrophone. Launders would have to do all the calculations manually in his head, based on incomplete information and educated guesses. The mathematics involved were mind-boggling. He needed to estimate the target's current position based on hydrophone bearings, which only provided directional information, not range. He needed to estimate the target's speed, calculated by the rate of bearing change over time, a technique that worked but required long periods of observation, and assumed the target wasn't changing speed. He needed to predict the target's depth, based on the sound propagation characteristics heard through the hydrophones, an art more than a science. Then he needed to estimate the target's future position at the moment the torpedoes would arrive, accounting for the target's speed, heading, and evasive manoeuvres, plus the time required for the torpedoes to travel from Venturer to the target. Torpedo ballistics added another layer of complexity. The Mark VIII torpedo had a maximum range of about 5,000 yards at high-speed setting, less at lower speeds. They ran at a fixed depth after launch, so Launders needed to set each torpedo to run at a different depth, creating a vertical spread that would increase the chance of hitting a manoeuvring target. He also needed to account for the torpedo's tendency to run slightly off course due to gyroscope drift, ocean currents, and manufacturing imperfections. Standard submarine doctrine called for firing a spread of torpedoes, multiple weapons launched at slightly different angles and depths to create a pattern that maximized hit probability. But Venturer only had 8 torpedoes total, and the forward tubes could only hold 4 at a time. Once those 4 were fired, it would take at least 10 minutes to reload the tubes, by which time the target would be long gone or more likely counterattacking with its own torpedoes. This was a one-shot opportunity. Miss with all 4 torpedoes, and Venturer would be defenseless, forced to run or die. Launders called for action stations at 11:17 a.m., 45 minutes after first detecting the target. The delay was deliberate. He wanted to observe the target's movements long enough to establish a reliable pattern. The zigzagging appeared to follow a rhythm, course changes roughly every 6 to 8 minutes, turns of about 30 degrees to either side of the base course. If Launders could identify the pattern, he could predict where the submarine would be when his torpedoes arrived. He explained his plan to the fire control party. They would fire all 4 bow tubes in a spread, with 17-second intervals between each torpedo. The first 2 torpedoes would be set to run at 60 feet depth, targeting the most likely position if the German submarine was running at standard patrol depth. The third torpedo would be set to run at 80 feet, and the fourth at 90 feet, creating a vertical spread that covered the range of depth a submarine might operate at in these waters. The horizontal spread would be calculated based on the target's estimated zigzag pattern. Launders predicted that the German submarine would be in the middle of a turn to starboard when the torpedoes arrived. He would aim the first torpedo at where the submarine was now, the second at where it would be if it continued turning, the third at where it would be if it completed the turn and steadied on a new course, and the fourth at a backup position in case his calculations were completely wrong. It was educated guesswork elevated to an art form. The fire control party, experienced submariners all, listened to Launders' plan with expressions of mixed awe and terror. What he was proposing had literally never been done before. If it worked, they would write history. If it failed, they would probably be writing their last letters home, assuming they survived the counterattack long enough to write anything. At 12:12 p.m, Launders gave the order. Fire 1. The torpedo leaped from the bow tube propelled by a burst of compressed air. The launch was surprisingly loud inside the submarine, a sharp bang followed by the whine of the torpedo's propeller as it accelerated away. 17 seconds later, Fire 2. Another bang, another torpedo racing into the dark water. Fire 3. Fire 4. In just under a minute, Venturer had emptied her bow tubes, sending 4 Mark 8 torpedoes toward a target the crew had never actually seen, based on calculations that existed only in their captain's mind. Launders immediately ordered emergency dive, take her down to 200 feet, maximum rate. If the German submarine detected the torpedo launch, it would attempt a counterattack, and Venturer needed to be deep and quiet before that happened. As the submarine tilted nose down and the depth gauge needle spun clockwise, the crew listened on hydrophones for any reaction from the target. They heard it almost immediately. The German submarine's engine note changed, RPM increasing as the captain ordered emergency speed. Course changed abruptly, the submarine turning hard and diving. They had heard the torpedoes coming. For the 73 men aboard U-864, the sound of torpedo propellers in the water was the nightmare every submariner feared most. There's no mistaking that sound. The high-pitched whine of propellers spinning at several hundred RPM, growing louder as the torpedoes close range. Captain Wolfram's response was immediate and instinctive. Dive, hard down angle, increase speed, turn away from the sound. The submarine tilted sharply as the diving planes bit into the water, sending men and loose equipment tumbling. The engine room poured maximum power to the electric motors. U-864 began to descend and turn, executing the only evasive maneuvers available to a submerged submarine. First torpedo missed, passing overhead as U-864 dove beneath it. The crew could hear it clearly, the propeller noise Doppler shifting as it passed above them and continued on into the distance. A collective exhalation. One weapon evaded. The second torpedo also missed, but by a narrower margin. It passed just to port, so close that some crew members swore they could hear the torpedo's guidance gyroscope whining inside its body. 2 down, but the initial relief was fading, replaced by the horrible realization that there were more weapons in the water. British submarines typically fired torpedoes in spreads of 4 or more. Where were the others? The third torpedo missed as well, passing astern as U-864's turn changed her position. Wolfram was breathing again, thinking they might actually survive this. His evasive maneuvers were working. The British captain had guessed wrong, or his calculations were off, or divine providence was smiling on U-864. 3 torpedoes evaded. 1 more, maybe 2, and they would be clear. The 4th torpedo struck U-864 amidships on the port side at 12:16 p.m., 4 minutes after launch. The explosion was catastrophic. 1,700 pounds of Torpex, the most powerful non-nuclear explosive available, detonated against the submarine's pressure hull with the force of a small earthquake. The hull ruptured instantly. At 150 meters depth, seawater pressure was nearly 220 pounds per square inch, 15 times normal atmospheric pressure. When the pressure hull failed, that water didn't leak in, it exploded in, a jet of seawater moving at the speed of sound, cutting through men and equipment like a chainsaw. U-864 broke in half. The centre section, containing the control room and the conning tower, simply disintegrated, torn apart by the initial explosion and the massive implosion that followed as seawater collapsed the damaged compartments. The bow section and stern section, separated by the blast, began to fall toward the ocean floor, flooding rapidly through the ruptured bulkheads. Aboard Venturer, now at 200 feet and running silent, the hydrophone operator heard the most terrible sound in submarine warfare, the grinding, cracking, popping noise of a pressure hull failing under depth, bulkheads collapsing, internal explosions as seawater reached batteries or compressed air flasks, the screech of tearing metal, then silence, broken only by the sound of debris falling through the water, hitting the seafloor 150 meters below. Launders waited 30 minutes before ordering Venturer back to periscope depth. He needed to confirm the kill, but he also needed to ensure there were no other German vessels in the area that might have detected the battle and come to investigate. Slowly, carefully, the British submarine rose through the water column until the periscope could break the surface. Launders rotated the scope through a full 360-degree sweep. Nothing. No ships, no aircraft, no sign of the battle that had just taken place. He directed the scope back to where U-864 had been. The surface was marked by an expanding oil slick, thick and dark, spreading across the choppy water. Floating debris, wood from the submarine's deck plating, scattered bits of equipment, a large cylindrical canister that looked like one of the external storage containers Type 9 U-boats carried. No survivors, no life rafts, no one waving for rescue. 73 men had died in the space of seconds. Captain Wolfram, who had commanded U-864 since her commissioning 14 months earlier. The 2 Messerschmitt engineers who would never transfer their knowledge to Japan. The 2 Japanese naval officers who would never see home again. 68 German submariners, most of them young men barely out of training, who had drawn the unlucky assignment to a doomed mission. The 65 tons of mercury now slowly seeping from ruptured containers into the Norwegian Sea, where it would remain an environmental hazard for decades. The jet engine parts, the guidance systems, the technical drawings, all resting on the ocean floor in 200 feet of water, never to reach their destination. Launders logged the position and time. Engagement concluded at 12:16 p.m., February 9th, 1945. Target destroyed. No friendly casualties. He ordered Venturer to clear the area and resume patrol. There was nothing more to be done here. The crew secured from action stations, the adrenaline slowly draining away, replaced by the numbing fatigue that followed intense combat. They had won. They had accomplished something that naval historians would later call impossible. But there was no celebration, no cheering, no wild jubilation. Submarine crews understood better than anyone the thin line between victor and victim. Today they had been lucky, skilled, yes, but also lucky. Tomorrow might be different. HMS Venturer continued her patrol for another 5 days before returning to Lerwick on February 14th. Launders submitted his patrol report, which was met with a mixture of amazement and scepticism at the Admiralty. A submarine had torpedoed another submarine while both were submerged, based only on hydrophone contacts and mathematical calculations. The claim seemed almost fantastical, like something from a Jules Verne novel rather than real naval combat. But the evidence supported Launders' report. Intelligence had predicted U-864's presence in that exact area. Post-war examination of German records would confirm that U-864 had been lost on February 9th, with all hands in the location Launders reported at the time he claimed. There was no other explanation for the submarine's disappearance. Launders had done exactly what he said he did. For his actions, Lieutenant James Launders was awarded a bar to his Distinguished Service Order, adding to the DSO he had already earned for previous actions. Several members of his crew received commendations as well, but the true recognition of Launders' achievement came from within the submarine service itself. The techniques he had pioneered, calculating firing solutions for submerged targets using only passive sonar and manual computation, became the foundation for all future submarine-versus-submarine tactics. When computers and guided torpedoes eventually made such attacks routine, the underlying principles still traced back to that February morning off Fedje. Operation Caesar died with U-864. The Japanese never received the mercury, jet engines, or technical expertise Germany had tried to send. Whether this materially affected the outcome of the Pacific War is debatable. Japan was already losing by February 1945, and no amount of advanced technology would change the fundamental imbalance of resources and industrial capacity. But the mission's failure was one more thread cut from the fraying rope that connected the Axis powers. By the time U-864 settled on the ocean floor, Nazi Germany had less than 3 months left before total surrender. The wreck of U-864 remained on the seafloor, largely forgotten, for nearly 60 years. In March 2003, Norwegian naval authorities located the wreck 2 nautical miles west of Fedje Island, exactly where Launders had reported the sinking. The submarine was in 2 main sections, bow and stern separated by about 50 metres, with debris scattered across a wide area. The conning tower and centre section, where the torpedo had struck, were largely missing, blown to fragments by the explosion and subsequent implosion. What made the discovery troubling was the cargo. The 65 tons of mercury, contained in 1,857 steel bottles stored in the keel, had been slowly corroding for 6 decades. By 2003, mercury was leaking into the surrounding environment at a rate of about 4 kilograms per year. Tests showed dangerous mercury levels in local fish populations, particularly cod, cusk, and edible crab. The area around the wreck was closed to fishing and boating. For years, Norwegian authorities debated what to do about the toxic wreck. Raising it would be extremely dangerous, both because of the mercury contamination and because U-864 still contained unexploded torpedoes and ammunition. Leaving it meant continued mercury pollution. In February 2017, exactly 72 years after the sinking, the Norwegian government implemented a solution. They entombed the wreck under 160,000 tons of rocks and sand, creating a half-metre thick cap that would contain the mercury and prevent further contamination. The broken submarine became its own tomb, a monument to the 73 men who died there, and a reminder of the environmental consequences of naval warfare. Lieutenant James Launders continued his naval career after the war, eventually reaching the rank of captain before retiring in the mid-1970s. He rarely spoke publicly about the sinking of U-864, maintaining the characteristic modesty of successful submarine commanders. When he did discuss it, he emphasized the crew's role rather than his own, and always acknowledged the element of luck involved. In a post-war interview, he said, "We spent 13 years preparing me for such an occasion. It would have been regarded as extremely dreary if I had fouled it up." He died in 1988 at age 73, the same number of men he had sent to the bottom in that long-ago engagement. HMS Venturer herself survived the war and was sold to the Royal Norwegian Navy in 1946, renamed Utstein. She served with the Norwegians until 1964, when she was finally scrapped, her career spanning nearly 2 decades and 2 navies. The engagement between HMS Venturer and U-864 stands alone in naval history. Despite thousands of submarine patrols, millions of hours spent hunting for enemy vessels, and countless engagements, no submarine has ever again sunk another submarine while both were completely submerged. Modern submarines have enormously sophisticated sensors, guided torpedoes with active homing systems, and computers that can calculate firing solutions in seconds. Yet even with all that technology, no submarine commander has replicated what James Launders accomplished with nothing but hydrophones, Mark VIII torpedoes, and mathematics. The reason is partly technological. Modern submarines are so quiet that detecting them with passive sonar is extremely difficult, even with sensors far more advanced than World War II hydrophones. They operate at depths that would have been impossible for Venturer or U-864. They carry weapons with ranges measured in tens of miles, not thousands of yards, making the kind of close-range stalking Launders conducted unnecessary and dangerous. But the reason is also strategic. Submarine-versus-submarine combat is rare because both sides work very hard to avoid it. Submarines are too valuable to risk in engagements with uncertain outcomes. Their primary mission is attacking surface vessels and gathering intelligence, not hunting each other. When submarines do encounter each other, modern doctrine emphasizes evasion over engagement, slipping away quietly rather than turning the encounter into a fight. Launders and Wolfram had no choice. They met in narrow coastal waters where there was nowhere to run, on a mission both considered vital to their respective war efforts. The engagement was forced by circumstance and decided by skill, calculation, and the random chance that put U-864's malfunctioning engine in the path of Venturer's patrol. The mathematics of that encounter are worth considering. Launders had estimated his target's position based on hydrophone bearings that might have been off by several degrees. He had calculated the target's speed based on rate of bearing change over about an hour, with no way to verify his calculations. He had guessed the target's depth based on sound propagation characteristics and the height of the snorkel above water. He had predicted the target's future position based on an assumed zigzag pattern that might or might not continue. Then he had launched 4 torpedoes, each requiring 4 minutes to reach the target, during which time the target moved nearly half a mile and changed depth by 50 feet. The fact that the 4th torpedo hit was a combination of extraordinary skill and outrageous luck. If U-864 had turned 3 seconds earlier or later, if Wolfram had chosen to dive a bit deeper or shallower, if the torpedo had run slightly faster or slower, if ocean currents had pushed it a few degrees off course, the engagement would have ended very differently. Launders might have emptied his torpedo tubes, missed with all 4 weapons, and faced a counterattack from a submarine that now knew exactly where Venturer was located. But the torpedo did hit, and U-864 died, and 73 men with her. In the calculus of war, particularly total war like World War II, where entire economies mobilized for mutual destruction, this was a clear British victory. 1 enemy submarine destroyed, 1 dangerous cargo prevented from reaching its destination, 1 mission accomplished. The cost was 4 torpedoes and some battery power. Clean, efficient, successful. But for the men aboard Venturer, who heard through their hydrophones the sound of U-864 breaking apart, the victory had weight. They were submariners too. They understood exactly what those sounds meant, what the men aboard U-864 experienced in their final seconds. The empathy between submarine crews, even enemy crews, was something surface sailors rarely understood. You had to have experienced the claustrophobia of living in a steel tube, the constant awareness of the crushing pressure just inches away beyond the hull, the vulnerability of being hundreds of feet underwater, with no possibility of quick escape, to fully appreciate what it meant when a submarine died. The story of HMS Venturer and U-864 is ultimately a story about the intersection of technology, mathematics, training, courage, and luck that defines all combat, but especially submarine warfare. It's about 2 crews of highly trained professionals doing their duty in a war neither had started. It's about the decisions made in split seconds that determine who lives and who dies. And it's about a moment in naval history that will never be repeated. The technical achievement represented by Launders' attack cannot be overstated. Modern submarine officers studying the engagement are consistently amazed that it worked at all. The variables involved, the uncertainty in every calculation, the complete lack of visual confirmation, all of it should have resulted in 4 torpedoes running harmlessly past their target, while alerting U-864 to Venturer's presence and location. Computer simulations of the engagement, run decades later with all the advantages of knowing exactly where both submarines were and what their courses and speeds actually were, suggest that Launders' probability of success should have been less than 10%. Yet the attack succeeded, not through blind luck, but through a combination of superb seamanship, mathematical brilliance, and intimate knowledge of how submarines behave. Launders understood that Captain Wolfram would follow standard evasive doctrine when threatened. He understood that the zigzag pattern, while unpredictable in detail, would follow certain rhythms because that's how submarine captains are trained. He understood sound propagation in seawater well enough to estimate depth from acoustic signatures. He understood torpedo ballistics well enough to manually calculate lead angles and arrival times. And he had the confidence, earned through years of training and successful patrols, to trust those calculations when firing weapons at a target he had never actually seen. That combination of skills is rare in any era, but particularly remarkable in a 25-year-old whose formal education in submarine warfare consisted of a few months at the submarine school in Gosport, and whatever he had learned during his operational patrols. The psychological dimension of the engagement is equally fascinating. Both captains knew they were in mortal danger from the moment contact was established. Both understood that detection meant death. For Wolfram, returning to Bergen with a malfunctioning engine, the appearance of a hostile submarine in his path must have felt like cosmic injustice. He had made the prudent decision to return for repairs rather than risk the mission. He was following procedures, maintaining proper caution. Yet that decision placed U-864 exactly where Venturer was patrolling at exactly the wrong time. For Launders, tracking a submerged target through hours of painstaking hydrophone work, the decision to attack rather than wait for the target to surface required enormous confidence. Surface attacks were safer, more certain, but surface attacks also gave the target a chance to escape, to dive and evade, to perhaps counterattack. Launders chose the harder path because it offered the better chance of success. The engagement also highlighted the critical importance of reliability in submarine warfare. U-864's engine malfunction, which seemed like a minor technical problem, created the acoustic signature that allowed Venturer to detect and track her. If the German submarine's engines had been running properly, she would have been virtually undetectable in the background noise of the ocean. Wolfram might have transited past Fedje, broken out into the Atlantic and successfully reached Japan. Operation Caesar might have succeeded, with unknowable consequences for the Pacific War. Instead, a malfunctioning diesel engine created enough noise to doom the submarine and everyone aboard. Modern submarine doctrine places enormous emphasis on quietness, specifically because of lessons learned from cases like U-864. A submarine that can be heard can be tracked. A submarine that can be tracked can be killed. The weather on February 9, 1945 played a crucial but often overlooked role in the engagement. The rough seas and poor visibility that made periscope observations difficult also prevented German patrol aircraft from spotting Venturer. If the weather had been clear, Launders would have faced the additional threat of aerial attack every time he raised his periscope. He might have been forced to remain deep, relying entirely on hydrophones, which would have made an already difficult tracking problem nearly impossible. The storm that made conditions miserable for both crews also provided the cover that allowed the engagement to occur without outside interference. Neither surface ships nor aircraft intervened. It was purely submarine versus submarine, skill versus skill, with nothing to tip the balance except the competence of the two captains and the courage of their crews. The ammunition Venturer fired that day represented years of industrial and scientific development. The Mark 8 torpedo had been designed in the 1920s and was considered somewhat obsolete by 1945, but it was reliable, well understood, and available in quantity. Each torpedo cost roughly £3,000 sterling to manufacture, equivalent to several years' wages for an average British worker. The Torpex explosive filling was a relatively new development, far more powerful than the TNT used in earlier weapons. The torpedo's guidance system, while primitive by later standards, was a marvel of mechanical engineering, using a gyroscope spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute to maintain heading and a hydrostatic valve to maintain depth. The propulsion system, powered by compressed air driving a turbine engine, could maintain 45 knots for over 3 miles, enough range and speed to catch most surface targets and, as it turned out, submerged submarines. The Mark 8 had limitations that made submarine-versus-submarine combat even more challenging. Unlike modern homing torpedoes, which can detect and track targets independently, the Mark 8 was completely dumb. Once launched, it ran in a straight line at a preset depth, until either hitting something or running out of fuel. There was no way to correct course, no way to adjust depth, no way to abort if the target was friendly. The torpedo's wake, a trail of bubbles created by the compressed air exhaust, was visible on the surface, potentially alerting the target, and the torpedo's relatively slow speed meant long running times during which the target could maneuver significantly. Launders had to compensate for all these limitations through calculation and prediction, essentially solving a 4-dimensional geometry problem in his head while managing a submarine in combat conditions. The crew of HMS Venturer that day represented a cross-section of British society thrown together by war. The hydrophone operator who first detected U-864 was a former bank clerk from Manchester who had joined the Royal Navy in 1941. The first lieutenant, responsible for managing trim and depth control during the attack, had been a schoolteacher before the war. The torpedo officer who prepared and fired the weapons was the son of a Yorkshire coal miner. The engineering officer who kept the submarine's machinery running was a graduate of Glasgow Technical College. They ranged in age from 18 to 35, came from different social classes and different regions, had different peacetime occupations and different plans for after the war. What united them was professional competence, mutual trust, and the understanding that survival depended on each man doing his job perfectly under conditions that offered no second chances. The training that produced such crews was itself a remarkable achievement. Britain's submarine service was relatively small compared to Germany's U-boat fleet or America's Pacific submarine force, but it maintained extraordinarily high standards. Every submarine officer underwent rigorous selection and extensive training at HMS Dolphin, the submarine school at Gosport. They studied navigation, engineering, tactics, and seamanship. They practiced attacks in simulators and at sea. They learned to calculate firing solutions manually, without computers or even mechanical calculators. They spent weeks aboard operational submarines, learning from experienced crews. By the time an officer like Launders took command of his own boat, he had been thoroughly prepared for every likely scenario. What he hadn't been prepared for, because no one had ever attempted it, was attacking a submerged submarine. That he succeeded anyway speaks to the quality of the fundamental training he received. The German crew of U-864 was equally well trained, though by 1945 the quality of U-boat crews was declining as experienced personnel were killed and replaced with increasingly inexperienced recruits. Wolfram himself was a seasoned officer who understood his craft thoroughly. His decision to use the snorkel rather than surface demonstrated good tactical sense. His zigzagging when he suspected a threat showed proper caution. His attempt to evade the torpedoes was textbook submarine doctrine. He did everything right, or at least everything that could be done given the limitations of his equipment and situation. But sometimes in war, doing everything right isn't enough. Sometimes the enemy does something better, or luck breaks the wrong way, or circumstances conspire against you. Wolfram was an experienced, competent commanding officer who made reasonable decisions based on the information available. His reward was death at the bottom of the Norwegian Sea. The cargo U-864 carried tells its own story about the desperation of Germany's strategic situation in early 1945. 65 tons of mercury seems like an odd thing to send to Japan, but mercury was critical for manufacturing advanced weapons. It was used in detonators for bombs and shells, in electrical switches for guidance systems, in instrumentation for aircraft and ships. Japan's mercury supplies had been largely exhausted by years of war. The Messerschmitt jet engine parts represented technology that Germany had pioneered and Japan desperately needed. Japanese aircraft industry was being systematically destroyed by American bombing. If they could begin producing jet fighters, it might slow the American advance, buy time for negotiated peace, or at least exact a higher price for Japan's conquest. The German and Japanese technicians aboard U-864 were walking encyclopedias of weapons technology, carrying knowledge that couldn't be transmitted by radio or written documents. Operation Caesar was predicated on the assumption that U-864 could successfully transit from Germany to Japan, a journey of roughly 15,000 miles through waters increasingly dominated by Allied naval and air forces. The route itself was evidence of Allied naval superiority. Rather than taking the direct route through the Mediterranean and Suez Canal, which was completely closed to Axis shipping, or the traditional Atlantic and Cape of Good Hope route, which was heavily patrolled, U-864 would have attempted the Arctic route. She would have transited north along the Norwegian coast, broken out into the North Atlantic somewhere between Iceland and Greenland, proceeded south past the east coast of North America, crossed the equator, rounded Cape Horn or transited the Straits of Magellan, headed northwest across the Pacific to Japan. The route added thousands of miles to the journey, but avoided the most heavily patrolled waters. Even so, the probability of success was low. Several other long-range supply submarines had attempted similar missions in 1944 and early 1945. Most were never heard from again. The intelligence network that detected U-864's mission and allowed the Admiralty to position Venturer for the intercept was one of the Allies' greatest advantages. The breaking of the German Enigma code by British cryptanalysts at Bletchley Park gave the Allies insight into German naval operations that the Germans never suspected. Every message transmitted by German naval headquarters was intercepted, and, more often than not, decrypted and analysed. When Operation Caesar was authorised and U-864's mission orders were transmitted, British intelligence knew about it almost immediately. They knew the submarine's departure point, her intended route, her cargo, and her destination. This allowed them to deploy submarines and aircraft to intercept her. Wolfram and his crew never knew they were sailing into a trap that had been prepared, based on their own headquarters' communications. The value of intelligence in warfare cannot be overstated, but intelligence is only useful if it can be acted upon effectively. Knowing that U-864 was somewhere in Norwegian waters on February 9th was valuable. Actually finding her in thousands of square miles of ocean required a combination of good positioning, persistent patrolling, and sharp observation. Launders put Venturer in the right place and maintained the discipline to investigate a contact that could have been dismissed as a fishing boat. The hydrophone operator had the skill to recognize something unusual in the acoustic signature. The crew had the patience to maintain contact for hours through tedious tracking. Intelligence provided the opportunity. Professional skill made the opportunity into success. In the aftermath of the sinking, British intelligence monitored German communications for any indication that they understood what had happened to U-864. The German Navy knew the submarine was overdue and presumed lost, but they never determined the cause. They considered several possibilities, including striking a mine, which was common in Norwegian waters, mechanical failure leading to catastrophic flooding, or enemy action, but they had no report of British submarines or aircraft in the area. The Norwegian resistance, which usually reported on German naval movements, had nothing to add. U-864 simply vanished. It wasn't until after the war, when British and German naval records were compared, that the Germans learned their submarine had been sunk by another submarine in submerged combat. By then, the outcome of the war was long decided, and the loss of U-864 was just one more statistic in a war that had consumed millions of lives. The post-war analysis of the engagement by naval historians and submarine officers has consistently reached the same conclusion. What Launders accomplished should not have been possible with the technology and information available in 1945. The successful attack required such precise calculation, such accurate prediction of enemy movements, and such perfect torpedo performance that replicating it would be nearly impossible even knowing all the variables in advance. Modern submarine combat simulations have repeatedly demonstrated that the most likely outcome of such an engagement is both submarines missing with their initial attacks, followed by a confused melee where both vessels try to evade while reloading for follow-up attacks. The fact that Launders scored a killing hit with his first and only spread is evidence of either extraordinary skill or extraordinary luck, and probably both. The legacy of HMS Venturer's achievement extends far beyond the single engagement. Submarine tactics worldwide evolved to incorporate the lessons learned. Hydrophone operators received better training in identifying and tracking submerged contacts. Officers practiced calculating firing solutions for submerged targets. Torpedo development began incorporating features that would make such attacks more feasible, including better depth keeping and eventually acoustic homing. By the Cold War, submarine-versus-submarine combat was recognized as a critical mission, and entire training programs were built around scenarios that traced their origin back to that February day off Fedje. The weapons and sensors became enormously more sophisticated, but the fundamental principles remained the same: detect without being detected, track patiently, calculate precisely, attack decisively. The environmental consequences of the sinking took decades to fully understand. Mercury is one of the most toxic substances known, particularly in its organic methylmercury form. When mercury enters the ocean, bacteria convert it to methylmercury, which accumulates in the food chain. Small fish absorb it from the water. Larger fish eat the smaller fish and concentrate the mercury in their tissues. Humans eating those fish can suffer mercury poisoning, which causes neurological damage, kidney failure, and birth defects. The 65 tons of mercury aboard U-864, slowly leaking from corroded containers over 60 years, contaminated local fish populations to the point where commercial fishing in the area had to be restricted. Cod and crab caught near the wreck site showed mercury levels far above safe consumption limits. The Norwegian government's decision to entomb the wreck under thousands of tons of rock and sand was controversial. Environmental groups argued that raising the wreck and removing the mercury would be safer in the long term. Maritime archaeologists wanted the wreck preserved as a war grave and historical site. The families of the German crew members wanted their relatives' remains recovered and properly buried. But the practical difficulties and dangers of raising a mercury-contaminated submarine wreck in deep water, containing unexploded ordnance, proved overwhelming. Entombment was the least bad option among several bad choices. The memorial placed at Fedje Island honours the 73 men who died aboard U-864, acknowledging that they were sailors doing their duty, regardless of which side they fought for. The ethics of submarine warfare, particularly the sinking of the U-864, deserve consideration. The men aboard the German submarine had no chance to surrender, no opportunity to escape. When the torpedo struck, they died instantly or drowned in the flooded compartments. This was not unusual in submarine warfare. Submarines by their nature fight from ambush, attacking enemies who rarely know they're under threat until weapons arrive. The crew of U-864 probably never saw HMS Venturer. They heard the torpedoes coming but had only seconds to react. There was no warning, no challenge, no option for surrender. This is fundamentally different from surface naval combat, where damaged ships can strike their colours and request quarter, or land combat where soldiers can surrender when their position becomes untenable. Yet submarine warfare in World War II was governed by necessity and mutual practice. German U-boats had sunk thousands of Allied merchant vessels without warning, often giving crews no time to abandon ship. The total warfare practiced by both sides left little room for chivalry or mercy. U-864 carried cargo that would extend the war and cause additional deaths. Preventing that cargo from reaching Japan was a legitimate military objective. Launders had no practical alternative to attacking with torpedoes. He couldn't surface and challenge the German submarine to surrender. He couldn't board her. He couldn't disable her without destroying her. His only option was to sink her, knowing that the crew would die. This was the grim calculus of submarine warfare, and both sides understood and accepted it. The personal cost of such decisions is something submarine commanders rarely discuss publicly, but it weighed on many of them. Launders spoke little about the sinking of U-864 in later years. When he did discuss it, he focused on the technical and tactical aspects, the calculations and decisions that led to success. He rarely mentioned the 73 men who died. This wasn't callousness, but rather the psychological defense mechanism that allowed submarine commanders to function in a role that required killing men they would never see, whose faces they would never know. The alternative, dwelling on the human cost of each successful attack, would make it impossible to continue fighting. So commanders compartmentalized, focusing on the mission, the tactics, the machinery of warfare, anything except the individual human beings on the receiving end of their weapons. The crew of HMS Venturer understood what they had done. They heard U-864 die through their hydrophones. They saw the oil slick and debris. Some of them had nightmares about it for years afterward. But they also understood that their success had prevented weapons and technology from reaching Japan, potentially saving Allied lives. They had fought and won a battle in a just war against fascist aggression. Their consciences could be clear even while their memories remained troubled. This contradiction, the necessity of killing in war combined with the human cost of such killing, is something every combat veteran must reconcile in their own way. The broader strategic impact of U-864's sinking was minimal. Japan would have lost the war regardless of whether Operation Caesar succeeded. The technological edge that Mercury and jet engines might have provided would have been overwhelmed by American industrial and numerical superiority. But wars are not decided by single actions. They are decided by the accumulation of thousands of small victories and defeats, each slightly shifting the balance until one side can no longer continue. U-864's sinking was one such small victory. It prevented weapons from reaching Japan. It demonstrated Allied control of the sea lanes. It cost Germany a valuable submarine and irreplaceable trained personnel, individually insignificant, but as part of the larger pattern of Allied dominance, it contributed to the inevitable outcome. The historical preservation of Venturer's achievement required careful documentation. Submarine operations were classified during the war, and many patrol reports remained secret for decades afterward. Launders' report on the engagement was eventually declassified and became available to researchers, but many details remained obscure until German records were also released. The reconstruction of exactly what happened required comparing British and German documents, interviewing survivors from other patrols who knew the techniques and procedures, and analysing the technical capabilities of both submarines. Only gradually did the full picture emerge of how a young British lieutenant accomplished something that naval doctrine said was impossible. The recognition of Launders' achievement within the submarine community was immediate and lasting. His name became synonymous with submarine excellence. Officers studying submarine tactics learned about the Venturer U-864 engagement as an example of perfect calculation. Under pressure, the techniques he used were analysed and incorporated into training programs. His patrol report was studied for lessons about hydrophone tracking, firing solution calculation, and decision-making under uncertainty. Decades after the event, submarine officers still referred to doing a Launders when discussing particularly difficult attacks on poorly located targets. The comparison between submarine warfare in World War II and modern submarine operations highlights how much has changed and how much remains the same. Modern submarines are nuclear-powered, capable of remaining submerged for months, travelling faster underwater than surfaced. Their sensors include sophisticated sonar arrays that can detect targets at ranges of tens of miles. Their weapons include guided torpedoes with acoustic homing and wire guidance, plus cruise missiles that can strike land targets hundreds of miles away. Command centres feature computer displays and automated fire control systems that calculate solutions in seconds. Yet the fundamental challenge remains the same: detect the enemy without being detected, manoeuvre into attack position, launch weapons accurately, evade counterattack. The technology has advanced enormously, but the essential nature of submarine warfare has changed remarkably little since Launders stalked U-864 through the Norwegian Sea. The preservation of HMS Venturer's memory has been the work of maritime historians and submarine veterans who understood the significance of her achievement. The Royal Navy Submarine Museum at Gosport maintains extensive records of her service, including Launders patrol reports, crew rosters, and technical specifications. The museum has hosted reunions of Venturer's crew over the years, giving the veterans an opportunity to share memories and ensure their story was properly recorded. As the generation that fought in World War II passed away, the urgency of preserving their first-hand accounts increased. Oral history projects captured interviews with submarine veterans, including some of Venturer's crew before their memories were lost forever. The technological artifacts of the engagement have mostly disappeared. The 4 Mark 8 torpedoes Venturer fired were never recovered, lying somewhere on the Norwegian seafloor near or beneath U-864's wreck. HMS Venturer herself was scrapped in 1964, her metal recycled for other purposes. U-864 remains entombed under thousands of tons of rock, inaccessible and slowly corroding. What survives are documents, photographs, memories recorded in interviews and memoirs, and the historical record that allows us to reconstruct what happened on that cold February day 80 years ago. The human dimension of the story cannot be forgotten. 73 German submariners died aboard U-864. They were sons, brothers, husbands, fathers. They left behind families who mourned them, friends who missed them, lives that would never be lived. Captain Wolfram was 33, years old when he died, married with 2 young children. The 2 Messerschmitt engineers were civilians, non-combatants in the technical sense, though their mission was military. The Japanese naval officers were far from home, serving their country in alliance with Germany. The ordinary seamen, most in their late teens or early 20s, had been drafted into service and sent to die in a steel tube beneath a cold foreign sea. Their deaths were not heroic or glorious. They were simply tragic, one more small piece of the enormous tragedy that was World War II. The men of HMS Venturer were also putting their lives at risk. Submarine service was among the most dangerous assignments in any navy. British submarines had a loss rate of roughly 20% during World War II. 1 boat in 5 never returned from patrol. The crews knew the odds and served anyway. They believed in their cause, trusted their officers, relied on their training. Venturer's crew survived the war, but they had no guarantee they would when they sailed from Lerwick that February morning. They faced the same ocean, the same enemy, the same dangers as the men aboard U-864. Fortune favoured them with better intelligence, better training, and a more skilled captain. That's the only thing that separated the quick from the dead. The memory of February 9th, 1945 endures because it represents something exceptional in the history of naval warfare. In all the centuries humans have fought at sea, from ancient galleys to modern aircraft carriers, this one engagement stands alone. 2 submarines, both submerged, both blind except for sound, hunting each other through dark water until one found and killed the other. It has never happened before. It has never happened since. It almost certainly will never happen again. Modern submarine combat, if it occurs, will be fought at long range with guided weapons and sophisticated sensors. The kind of close-range, hydrophone-guided attack that Launders executed belongs to history, preserved in documents and memories, studied by naval officers who understand they are looking at a moment that will never be repeated. HMS Venturer and U-864 met by chance in the waters off Fiji Island. Both captains were skilled and experienced. Both crews were well-trained and professional. One had better intelligence, better luck, and a commanding officer whose mathematical genius allowed him to accomplish the impossible. The other had a malfunctioning engine that created just enough noise to be detected and tracked. In the end, that made all the difference between survival and death, between going home and going to the bottom. The submarine service understands this better than anyone. There is no middle ground in submarine combat. You sink or you are sunk. You survive or you die. There is no honourable second place, no fighting retreat, no surrender with honour. Every patrol is an all-or-nothing proposition. The story of how HMS Venturer sank U-864 is ultimately a story about the men who fought in the silent service, as submariners called it. They fought battles no one saw, in waters no one could observe, using skills no one outside their community understood. When they succeeded, as Launders did, they received quiet recognition within their service but little public acclaim. When they failed, they simply disappeared, lost at sea with all hands, leaving behind only oil slicks and debris. The monument to submarine crews isn't marble or bronze. It's the memory maintained by those who understand what they accomplished and the price they paid. The crew of HMS Venturer accomplished something remarkable on February 9, 1945. They sank an enemy submarine in combat that should have been impossible. They prevented dangerous cargo from reaching Japan. They survived to tell the tale. That's enough. That's everything.